Continuing The Naked Civil Servant by Quentin Crisp. Chapter 25. After being rejected by many religious orders, in some instances because she wasn't rich, and in others because she couldn't sing, the Czech's true love finally found a convent that would admit her. She made a request that for some time I had been secretly dreading. She asked me to go occasionally when she had left the world, to visit the Czech and the mental hospital into which he had been clapped. About 8 times a year, for about 8 years, I made reluctantly the journey that she had undertaken without complaint every Sunday for so long. Added to her special difficulties with traveling was the burden of reproaches with which the patient loaded her for having placed him in captivity. When he was not blaming her, he was demanding that she produce proof that she was herself and not an impostor cunningly got up by them to look like her. In spite of the gloomy and sometimes hostile reception that she came to know awaited her, she made this weekly excursion without fail, even in snowy weather, which sometimes caused her to fall more than once in a few yards. When I took over her duty, I was relieved to find that I was met with no reproaches, and was never asked to prove that I was myself. Who else could I be? By that time he had become merely a funny old gentleman. He wore a monocle, and decorated his discourse with quaint flourishes of style and quotations from French, Latin, and other languages, for he was riddled with penguin scholarship. He was no trouble. We sat and talked in a room whose floor was so polished that even the sane could hardly stand upright, and which was full of inmates and their relatives. We were careful not to look out of the window, because among the laurel bushes that luxuriated in the grounds, men were in the habit of exposing themselves to the visitors, a sight which tended to interrupt my train of conversation. We drank tea. He purchased 3 cups, explaining, "The place is an absolute madhouse." I tried to perform gladly the chore that had been bequeathed to me, but the trouble was that I was stuck, with a 2-hour journey there, 2 hours of gibberish, and a 2-hour journey back, in loving mummery of a woman who, being a nun, was as if already dead. The man I was visiting I had never liked even when he was normal. It was distressing to find that, in the midst of his wild mental derangement, his character had remained as unpleasant as before. Even in circumstances where everybody's personality appeared to an outsider to have been reduced to a cipher, he was still snobbish beyond the wildest dreams of the Mitfords, sentimental and oozing with sly, circuitous jokes about sex. However, I was mindful of the fact that soon I too, unless I was very lucky, would reside in an institution which I would doubtless find so boring that even the sight of those who despised me would seem welcome. Then, one day, I received from the hospital a letter written partly in Old English to warn me that the Czech would be coming to see me. I was surprised, but, when I had thought about it, slightly relieved. An outing would constitute a greater diversion for him than a visit in the surroundings that he hated, and I would be spared the long journey out of London and back. I rejoiced too soon. His arrival was to make greater demands on our thinly spread friendship than I had dreamed possible. He had hardly been in my room for 2 minutes before he kissed me. At first I thought that if I remained calm, bordering on benign, what I took to be a squall of sex would subside and serenity would be restored. I was wrong. The situation got worse. It became obvious that this was a climax in our relationship for which the Czech had been waiting for some time. From amazement at the freakishness of this encounter, I rapidly passed to the opposite point of view. The whole thing was pathetically inevitable. This was the measure of his loneliness. I was the limit of his degradation. Though I was somewhat confused as to whether or not I was carrying to their logical conclusion the nun's instructions, I felt that I could not do otherwise than try to comply with the wishes of her former lover. If I could not say that I was morally shocked, if I could not claim that I had anything to lose, then it was the least that I could do. His hair and his whole body were covered with cod liver oil. He explained that, if taken internally it was salubrious, then it must likewise be good for the skin. Also, as I saw for myself, it turned his hair gold. This, he felt, made him look younger and more desirable. Until this moment it had always puzzled me that fish did not bother with propinquity, but instead conducted the business of procreation by remote control. I understood them now. In return for my compliance, though it was less than whole-hearted, the Czech used to bring me tributes of molten chocolate and ruined meat pies, which he had somehow obtained from the institution. Once he took the trouble to carry to my room a suitcase full of fallen apples, heavy with maggots, that spent the afternoon crawling sensually over the bed cover. At first I tried to act kind of cute on receiving these presents. I said, "Oh, but you shouldn't have," and I meant it. Even in depravity I lacked stamina, and, though his visits thinned out during the course of the ensuing years, my amenability thinned faster. I found myself, at the age of 50 and more, fleeing like a crotchety nymph before a satyr of 70. As I look back on this whole episode, I am assailed once again with the feeling that overtakes me whenever I think of anyone that I have known well. I didn't do enough. Chapter 26. By the early 1950s, when I was writing my book, the inhabitants of Fitzrovia had come a long way, all of it downhill, from the happy time. Tony had succeeded in offending somebody, and he must have sat up all night to think how to do that. And his clientele had left in favor of a cafe called the Alexandria. This place was Tony's mixed with water, as Tony's had been the Low Dive mixed with water. The Low Dive had set a standard that now only middle-aged hooligans could remember, and to which they looked back as Mrs. Lot at Sodom. It had been a paper-backed café royale, opened, I imagine, especially for outsiders because of its unique location in a dim alleyway in Soho. No sunlight, not even a hated breath of fresh air, ever reached its door or those grime-caked gratings that only a house agent could have called windows. The whole vie de bohème was passing without hope or warning. It is a way of life that has two formidable enemies, time and marriage. Even hooligans marry, though they know that marriage is for a little while. It is alimony that is forever. There was a shop in Old Compton Street, whose proprietors served tea and coffee with one hand and foreign newspapers with the other. Here I saw the entire cycle from hope to despair acted out before my very eyes in the course of 2 years. As I sat, drinking cup after cup of pale gray tea, some girl that I didn't know from Eve would flop down beside me and engage me in conversation. After a while, with any luck, she would let slip some such words as, "Do you still do Gravesend?" Then I would know that she had been a student there. She would tell me that she had won a scholarship to the Slade or the Academy. On her next visit to the French, she would be accompanied by a pot-bellied giant, with a kitchen tablecloth shirt and a face that was no more than a clearing in the jungle. After that there seemed only time for another round of teas before she would return with a baby in arms. With it, she would sit far back in the cafe so as not to be questioned about her private life by any policewoman who happened to be passing. There was no such thing as a hooliganette. The rest was silence. When next the man was seen, it was not in a cafe, but in a public house. He was alone. The girl had been sold into slavery, and the child, once hailed as the youngest layabout in the world, was living with its grandparents in Upper Norwood. This would count as a story with a happy ending. In some cases, all souls were lost. The man also went to live in Upper Norwood. The other enemy of the vie de bohème was old age. Hooliganism requires considerable stamina and a degree of adaptability that a lot of people lose with the passing of the years. The monasteries of Bohemia demanded more of their brotherhood than some are prepared to give. The daily routine of back-breaking idleness proves too much for certain novices. The self-inflicted orgies that are the inevitable punishment for the slightest deviation into the bourgeois way of life are more than their frail flesh can stand. Many discover to their shame that they have scruples. They have roots, and, greatest disadvantage of all, they have hope. The fathers superior of the order do not try to influence their children in Satan. They merely shake their heads in sorrow. They know that the apostate must work out his own damnation. Even I, though I felt no attraction toward respectability, began to lose some of my enthusiasm for vagabondage. I took a permanent job again in another display outfit. I was introduced to its director by a female inmate of the house where I lived. She was the firm's secretary, though her manner seemed hardly subdued enough for such a position. She was the richest and noisiest girl in the world. In spite of the fact that she could have bought St. James's Place, and frequently threatened to, as soon as she heard about our house she longed to live in it. There she felt she would be free. The place already had the reputation of being a home for incorrigibles. I had taken my room while the landlady was away running a hostel for foreign sailors in Portsmouth, where, toward the end of the war, she was almost the only thing left standing. When she came back to London, she accepted me as one of the hazards of her dedication to humanity. Her house was the last in England which was run for the benefit of the tenants. Although this is the age of amateur landladies, some of whom were hooligans in their day, all but my landlady gradually sold out to the other side. They defiled their lips with such phrases as lowering the tone of the neighborhood and depreciation of property. They broke their vows of squalor and changed their role from party giver to light sleeper. With the help of time and Mr. Wilson, I became what Mr. Rockman would have called a stat, but there is no doubt that I would have been evicted somehow by anyone who was not the patron saint of hooligans. It was once discovered by the few who went out to work that there was a strange man sleeping night after night in an armchair stored under these stairs. When they informed my landlady, she was appalled. "Oh," she gasped, "he must be so cold. Couldn't one of you lend him a blanket?" In these circumstances it required real talent to get turned out, but the display secretary succeeded. In the little back room behind mine, she fought with a boxer dog and its owner until the neighbors ran up the walls and the blood ran down with a gurgling sound. I went permanently into half-mourning when she left. She was a true friend. She used to drive me, squeaking with delight, through the streets of London at 85 miles an hour. I was one of her favorite passengers, because I was among the happy few who, so far from trying to restrain her rashness, urged her on to greater feats of daring. As we roared down an avenue of red lights one day, 2 nuns stepped off the pavement in front of us. "Get them," I cried. Saint Teresa longed to hear the clock strike, because every hour was 1 hour nearer the grave. Since her time there must have been some fresh arrangement. As we swerved toward them, the nuns leaped back onto the path like two huge black crows. My friend's car was built so that its occupants lay rather than sat, with their heads almost on a level with the curb. It was wide enough for two narrow people, but there were often three of us in it. On these occasions I was in the middle, partially reclining on the other passenger's fair ripening breast. Every time the driver changed gear, she nearly changed my sex. "You should worry," she snapped. The firm of which this girl was, for a while, the secretary, was somewhat unconventional. It dealt chiefly in counter-display units, stands, trays, containers, which manufacturers employ a special man to cajole, or in the last resort, bully, the concessionaires into using in their shops. Everyone hates these labor-creating devices. The travelers are embarrassed at having to distribute them. The retailers resent having to devote time to erecting them. As soon as the manufacturer's man has got back into his car, the shopkeeper flings the display unit into a dim corner of his stockroom. The traveler knows this and complains to the board of directors because he knows that what is needed is not a means of bringing the manufacturer's name to public notice, but some way of using up excess profits without having to resort to the embarrassing extreme of giving the money to someone who might need it. The makers of point-of-sale units provide one of the largest and most satisfactory sources of income for the inhabitants of Soho. These gadgets have to be hand-painted and packed. The work can be done at odd times and in odd clothing. It requires no skill and no employment cards. It calls for great concentration of energy for short spaces of time. Squares seem to resent this. Real-life husbands and children make it difficult for them ever to work day and night with only a few hours' sleep taken on workbenches. To muster a force of hooligans, it is only necessary to know the name of one. Like the inhabitants of the village of the damned, information given to one is simultaneously understood by all. The trouble is that outsiders almost never have telephone numbers, often do not have addresses, and occasionally do not have names. That I had all three sometimes made me an object of suspicion in Soho. Still eyes look coldly upon me. Cold voices whisper and say, "He is crazed with the spell of suburbia. They have stolen his wits away." The monotony of painting display units did not worry me. If I had ever had a soul, it had been destroyed long ago. What I expected from any kind of work had changed with the years. I no longer did it to show that I could, as though being employed were a dazzling virtue that I might flaunt before my detractors. I merely wanted a sitting-down job that would yield a change of agony from posing. I was not grieved to find myself engaged in a pursuit that could only lead to more of the same thing. The time for having a career was far behind me. Without a murmur, I painted the faces of 4,000 dolls. Then my boss offered to take me into the firm as a full-time member of her staff of one. I accepted gladly, though for me no job could ever be more than a seaside romance with respectability. My duties as a permanent employee were different from the freelance work. I made cocoa and washed up the cups. I added up my wages and subtracted my income tax. I typed letters and filed the replies. I answered the telephone and learned how odd my voice sounded to other people. A telephone conversation with an unknown woman client with a baritone voice ended in her saying, "Your voice is very deep. It's almost as low as mine, and I'm frequently taken for a man. Over the phone, I mean." After that, I tried to round out my voice and pitch it lower. I never found a way of eliminating its jangling quality of a ruined piano that I noticed when I later heard myself speak on a tape recorder. Almost immediately, I began to be offered appointments with fear over the telephone. These were less sinister than the calls I received at home. Receptionists of other firms, who had originally dialed our number in error, rang a second time from a switchboard on which other people were listening. The only work directly connected with display that I ever attempted was to think up and draw a picture of, or sometimes merely to act out, gimmicks, preferably with some mechanical movement to them. A subcontractor, once he had understood my mime, could make these in wire or wood or what you will. My far more essential function was to keep the peace between my employer and the outer world. This was no light task. She was never polite to people unless they had more money than she. I pointed out that this behavior was founded on a vanishing myth. The working classes, whom she thought she was addressing, had long since been replaced by the striking classes. Strangely enough, to her employee, she was extremely kind. As soon as we were alone in the office, which was frequently for days on end, we drank a mixture of Canadian whiskey and Coca-Cola and played Scrabble. I played all games seriously, even nastily. They provided an enclosed world whose triumphs compensated me somewhat for a lifetime of defeat elsewhere. Another interest that we were able to share was watching from the office window the girls leaning against the walls of the street below. We measured the amount of time they were out of sight with the men they had picked up, including getting into her flat and returning from it to the street. One woman was sometimes away for only 7 minutes. In the midst of such preoccupations as these, some subcontractor's van man would appear in the doorway, and I would be seized with a spasm of industry. Flinging off my shoes and socks, I would start to run up and down the stairs with boxes under my arm. This activity, which sometimes went on for more than 2 hours, was so strenuous that I tore my calf muscle from the Achilles tendon. The van was in the street, and the office was on the second floor, and as many as 250 boxes had to be transferred from one to the other before someone came along to tell us that the lorry would have to move on. When this happened, if the policeman looked inexperienced, I would clasp my hands under my chin and say, "Oh, officer, have I done the wrong thing again?" This sometimes had the desired effect. A dazed, almost a bruised look would creep over the face of the young man, and he would walk away, hardly knowing where he was going. After 4 years of these antics, I left. If you traffic in ideas, on however low a level, 4 years is a long time. I have yet to meet a commercial artist, or a copywriter with a marble clock. But an accountant, if he told you that he had been with one firm a long time, might mean 24 years. It was as well that I left when I did, for about 6 months after my departure, the firm collapsed. Now the building that housed it has been removed, carefully like a slice of cake. Weeds grow where I once stood. While I was still in this display job, I used, after office hours, to pose in evening classes, go to the movies, or sit in cafes and pubs. During the past 10 years, the ban on me had slowly lifted like a mist. Visibility was now so good in the coach and horses that a man was asked to leave because he persistently made fun of me. When this happened, I knew for sure that Soho had become a reservation for hooligans. We could at last walk majestically in our natural setting, observed but no longer shot at by the safaris that still loved to penetrate this exotic land. Continued in the next installment. And thank you for listening.